Germany, August 1943, the air was wrong, not just thick with smoke, but heavy with the realization that something unthinkable had just happened. The people of Koblenz awoke to fire. Wasn't supposed to be like this. They were too deep inside the Reich, too far for American fighters. That was the belief. That was the lie. Now the lie was in flames. A boy ran barefoot through the rubble, coughing, eyes wide. Behind him, a fountain had turned into a crater. Overturned carts, broken bicycles, smashed window panes. Germany's interior had become its front line. Coming in low, a shape no one wanted to believe, a twin-boomed demon, smooth and silver, slicing through the smoke with purpose, not retreating, not afraid. AP-38 Lightning followed its flight path home from the German heartland, engines howling like banshees warning that nowhere was safe anymore. One woman screamed, shielding her child. Not from bombs, but from the shock of seeing invasion without infantry, fire without warning. Meanwhile, 60 miles west, at a Luftwaffe airfield near the Eifel forest, the silence hit harder than the explosions. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland stood still, headphones dangling around his neck. He had just received the unthinkable. P-38s confirmed operating past Frankfurt, escorting B-17s and engaging FW-190s, full radio logs attached. He didn't answer, not yet, just watched the horizon, where 2 of his own fighters failed to return. Behind him, mechanics scrambled. Too late, the damage was done. Galland lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, not from fear, from fury. His warning had come 2 months ago. It was ignored, ridiculed, his commanding officer. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had laughed. The Americans cannot reach Germany with fighters. Their bombers will die as planned. But they hadn't. They had come farther, faster and smarter than anyone in Berlin had agreed was possible. And now, they were flying home alive. Galland exhaled smoke into the smoke-filled morning. "They're not coming," he muttered, voice low, broken. "They're already here." 6 years earlier, the skies over Spain were blue, cloudless, and silent. For now below, a young pilot from Germany adjusted his leather gloves one last time. The Hispano airframe beneath him rumbled, eager. 23-year-old Adolf Galland, tall, serious-eyed, and calm, even when he shouldn't be, gazed forward. He focused on the horizon, not because of fear, but because he already knew how war would unfold. The year was 1937, and Galland was flying for the Condor Legion, a Nazi unit secretly fighting in the Spanish Civil War. Others were here for glory, for blood, for fame. Galland, he took notes. When they fly all at once, he once said, they fall all at once. He watched, learned, and understood things not from books, but from black smoke and shattered wings. Within weeks, he had devised a tactic that allowed him to kills in a single disengagement. Not luck, calculation. Back home in Germany, his reports began to echo through the Luftwaffe's tightest rooms. This one wasn't just brave, he was dangerously observant. By 1939, at only 27, he was placed in charge of his own squadron by Battle of France. He was already flying with aces by Battle of Britain. He was one of them. But the difference was this. Galland didn't fall for theater. He saw through Göring's slogans, understood the growing enemy advantage, knew the RAF's resolve couldn't be starved out by bombs alone, and said so. He became loud about it. Too loud, in early 1941, Göring summoned Galland to Berlin. The 2 men sat opposite each other under marble ceilings, the war map laid out before them like a game. "You are arrogant," Galland, Göring said, and often right, which is worse. Galland just stared. "I will be more right in the future," he replied, and he was. While other war heroes basked under propaganda spotlights, Galland stayed in the cockpit or at headquarters pushing hard for strategy shifts. The high command refused to consider fighter protection for bombers. Jet deployment before the skies were lost. Specialized fighter groups for long-range defense, he offered all of it. Göring sneered. "The Americans will never get past the coastal flak divisions. They don't have the fuel to reach Berlin." Galland nodded. He had seen the Lightnings in North Africa. He knew better, and when whispers came that the P-38 Lightning had been re-equipped, longer legs, newer fuel tanks, he understood what came next. In July 1943, Galland filed a formal warning. He called the P-38 variant a strategic pivot point in the Allied air war. He submitted fuel calculations, escort range maps, radar intercept data, copy after copy, number after number. The response: silence. Then, Laughter Göring himself dismissed the report as being based on fear, not fact. And so, on August 17, 1943, when the P-38s guided American B-17s through the Ruhr Valley like hounds leading lions, Galland was not surprised. He had seen the tsunami coming, one pilot later said. While the rest of Berlin insisted the sea was flat, he was a man flying 10 minutes ahead of impact, and that's exactly why they stopped listening. Berlin, summer 1943. The walls of the Reich Aviation Ministry loomed tall and cold, bathed in marble and crowned with the insignia of a regime still convinced of its own invincibility. Inside, war maps stretched from floor to ceiling. Lines were drawn in red string. Markers dotted cities across France, Belgium, and the Western Front, showing damage reports, air intercepts, shifting bomber patterns. The enemy had changed. The skies were moving. But at the center of the room, puffing a thick cigar and sharpening a ceremonial dagger, Hermann Göring looked amused, almost entertained. The red lines meant nothing to him. The figures meant even less. The Luftwaffe was the Reich's sword, and he was the hand that wielded it. 3 new intelligence reports sat unread on his desk. Each one told the same story. American P-38 Lightnings had escorted bombers deeper into Axis territory than ever before, past Belgium, past the Rhine, nearly to the industrial heart of Germany. Outside Berlin, cities burned. Inside Berlin, arrogance reigned. The door opened. Footsteps crossed the marble floor. A young officer stopped short, hesitant. "The Americans have resumed deep penetration raids," he said. Today's target was Regensburg. Escorts were confirmed as far as Wiener Neustadt. Göring didn't look up. He waved it off with a disinterested flick of his ringed fingers. "Propaganda," he said. "Their engines can't manage the round trip. They'll fall from the sky on their way home." Another door opened. This time, no announcement. Galland walked in. Adolf Galland, ace pilot, general tactician, walked straight up to the table and placed a document folder in front of Göring, without a word. Losses coordinates, radio intercept logs, altitude, time on station, departure and return times. The math didn't lie. The Lightnings were not only making it, they were staying, engaging, winning. Galland spoke calmly, coldly. "We've lost 30% of ZG-76 in 2 days." Göring finally looked up, annoyed. "They worry too much in the field. Frontline men are always nervous. You've seen war, Galland. You should know better." Galland's jaw didn't move. He simply stared. He said, "I've seen what happens when truth is ignored." Göring moved the report aside with the edge of his dagger. "You worry too much. The Americans cannot maintain that range. The Lightning is a toy. It's impossible." Galland didn't speak. He let the silence answer. 2 days later, they received confirmation that P-38 Lightnings had escorted bombers over Schweinfurt and had inflicted heavy losses on 3 German squadrons attempting to intercept. In mess halls and hangars, pilots whispered bitter jokes. One squadron chalked Danke Göring onto the side of a downed Bf-109. Propaganda. Broadcasts declared another successful interception over the West. The reality was blood in the clouds. Göring sent out revised orders, increase morale operations, censor defeatist chatter, and prepare new drafts of teenage recruits to fill pilot shortages. No change in escort strategy, no investment in longer-range intercept groups, no admission of failure. Galland met once more with Reichsmarschall Göring that week. He repeated the warning. The losses, the projection. Göring lit another cigar. "This is temporary. They'll stop themselves. It's not sustainable." Galland turned without saluting and left without orders. He walked past young recruits who could barely shave, watching mechanics repair bullet-riddled fighters with stripped parts off already destroyed wings. Inside his thoughts, the war had split into 3 fronts. 1, against the strength of the Americans in the air. 2, against the Luftwaffe's technological lag, growing with each day. And 3, the worst, against a high command at war with reality, led by a man with the power to save thousands, and the pride to let them die. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, and the man holding the bandages had decided the wound didn't exist. The air smelled like gasoline, blood, and scorched earth. August 17, 1943, thousands of civilians in Schweinfurt and Regensburg looked to the sky that morning and saw specks, dark shapes crawling across the blue, larger than birds, moving with impossible precision. Some pointed, others prayed. Most just stood silently, already knowing what was coming. It was the first coordinated American deep penetration raid in the history of the War-II cities, hit simultaneously. A force of almost 400 B-17 flying fortresses roared across the German sky in wide formation, engines humming like machines marching toward judgment. But this time, they weren't alone. P-38. Lightnings flanked the formation, escorting bombers deeper than any German general had believed possible. Some said it was suicide to attempt it. Others said it defied physics. Adolf Galland simply called it inevitable. He was at his command post near Würzburg, binoculars in hand, head tilted skyward. Not to admire the bombers, but to watch the dance he had predicted for months finally unfold. He didn't cheer. He didn't panic. He braced for silence. His kill groups launched Bf-109s and Fw-190s, climbing into air already clogged with flak and contrails. In theory, they would tear the bombers apart. In practice, they never got close. The lightnings were already waiting. German pilots screamed alerts over comes fighters on our 6 lightning. Lightning. I can't shake, and then static. 1. Veteran A's, shot down from the clouds above Bavaria, would later say from his hospital bed they were not planes. They were gods with steel wings. We never saw them coming. They were above and behind before we even found an angle. By noon, more than 400 Luftwaffe fighters had scrambled. By 16 o'clock hours, over 60 had been shot down. Entire squadrons wiped off the map in a single sword. This was the breaking point at Luftwaffe headquarters. Reports came in faster than officers could process. One colonel whispered, "Today we lost the sky." At the same hour, Adolf Galland stood at the large operations map, drawing circles, eloquent, controlled, deliberate. No one interrupted him. He turned to his staff and said what no one else dared. "We will never intercept them again without our own long-range gods in the sky." Not a single officer disagreed. But none would say it in Berlin. That evening, Galland drove alone to a makeshift emergency hospital near Mainz. Not for a speech, not for orders, just to look. Rows of burnt pilots, cracked helmets, empty bedsheets where names had once been. A mechanic clutched a photo of his brother killed that afternoon in a Messerschmitt that never even reached firing range. Galland sat beside the man and asked no questions. There were none left to ask. Later that night, in his personal quarters, he opened a leather-bound notebook and wrote 6 words. "I warned them. They didn't listen." The next day, Göring promoted a theater actor to colonel for boosting morale. Galland didn't attend the ceremony. He was surveying Reichstadt from the sky down. The Reich's Air Force had shattered, and the deepest break wasn't in steel or glacis, was in trust. September 1943. The sky was quieter now, but not because the danger had passed. The silence was the kind that settles after loss. When even anger seems redundant, the Luftwaffe was no longer responding with confidence. It was reacting with desperation. Fighter groups were thinned to shadows. Squadrons scrambled with fewer planes and newer frightened pilots, barely old enough to shave. In his private offices, Adolf Galland laid out a final plan. Not a suggestion, not a theory. A mission. He wrote it by hand. 5 pages. Clear, decisive, impossible for even Berlin to misinterpret. Bullet point 1. Deploy me 262 jet fighters in operational sorties immediately. Bullet point 2. Shift existing fighter units to escort response focus only. No more blind interception of bomber formations. Bullet point 3. Reassign rested veteran pilots as squadron instructors. Train for survival, not sacrifice. And finally, establish operational fuel corridors beyond the reach of Allied bombing paths. If you wanted your pilots to fight, you had to guarantee their return down to its bones. The plan was designed to buy Germany time, not victory. Galland never used words like that anymore. He finished writing at 2:34 a.m., folded the paper with shaking hands, poured a small glass of schnapps, and stared at nothing for 5 full minutes. Then he stood, walked to the mirror, and said out loud, If they don't accept this, they'll accept my resignation instead. He arrived at Reich Air Ministry wearing his dress uniform. Boots polished, medals displayed the face of obedient command. But inside, he'd already walked away. The room was full of smoke cigarettes, cigars, misery. Göring was there, pacing before a full-length air map. Still reciting slogans like magic spells, they're no closer to strategic dominance. Not yet, not while we. Galland dropped the plan on the table without a salute. Göring looked up with the wide-eyed glare of a predator who'd been cornered for the first time. He seemed tired. What is this? Reality, Galland answered. Another silence. Another storm gathering between two men trapped in the same uniform. Göring didn't read it, not fully. He skimmed, scoffed, tossed it back. So now you want to run the air war yourself. Galland didn't take the bait. I want to win the air war. That war is already lost, Göring said too quickly. Maybe by accident. Galland's jaw moved slightly, but the words didn't come. He stared at the man who once commanded his respect, and now barely held the room. If this plan is too bold, find someone bolder. If you have someone smarter, use him. But if your answer is to do nothing, his voice didn't break. It only dropped to a whisper made of flame. Then misery will visit your doorstep the same way it's visited mine. That night, Galland received a response, not a letter, not an appointment, a reassignment slip. He was being moved. Strategic Advisory Command, an invented position. No authority, no pilots, no power. Göring had removed him not by discharge, but by disappearance. Galland didn't protest. He didn't call the adjutant. He quietly packed his effects, including his diary, a pair of cracked goggles from a wreck he had pulled a young pilot out of, and a photograph of himself standing beside his first Luftwaffe squadron before reality had set in. Everyone knew the Luftwaffe didn't need another ace. It needed a time machine, and the one man who saw that had just been sent into silence. August 17th, 1943, 0900. Hours the sky was burning. Silver streaks rolled in from the west. B-17 flying fortresses by the hundreds, their engines rumbling like the roar of gods. But this time, they didn't come alone. Above and beside them, dancing like predatory shadows, flew a new presence. Twin-boomed beasts, the American P-38 Lightnings, fast, long-range, deadly. Adolf Galland stood at the edge of a forward airfield, his gloved hands shaking slightly at his sides. He had known this day would come, the day the Americans would bring the war to the very lungs of the Reich. He had warned them. He had laid it out in maps and memos. But now, the truth screamed down from the heavens, and it was too late. All of them now. The klaxons howled as hangar doors cracked open. Mechanics ran through puddles of oil and sweat. Young pilots? Boys, really. Many with barely 20 hours in the sky climbed into trembling Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, their faces pale beneath leather helmets. Galland climbed into his own BF-1. Mine? His headset crackled. Eagle 1. This is Falcon 3. They're coming in from the southwest. Too fast. Too high. He closed his eyes for a beat, then fired up the engine, its nose jerking the plane forward as it screamed awake within minutes. The sky above southern Germany had turned into a brutal, swirling cauldron of contrails. And death. Galland climbed hard, banking into a rise. He caught a glimpse of them, the 15s flying cover, the bombers in staggered formation. And then, like Hell's own lightning, the American fighters peeled off in synchronized attack. His squadron was already in disarray. Break left. Break left. He's on my 6. Oh God, OH, the transmission cut off with a spiking hiss of static. Galland spotted his wingman, barely 19 diving behind him, trying to evade a pursuing P-38. Its guns lit up, red tracers shredding the sky. Franz's plane jerked in midair, trailing smoke, spiraling. Pull out, Franz. No response. Only sputtering static. Galland followed the spinning wreck, diving into the hurricane of war. Franz's cockpit canopy detached. A shape ejected, but the parachute didn't open. A streak fell lifeless into the earth below. Galland's world narrowed. It wasn't just an air battle now. It was a funeral in motion. Back on the coms, silence. No jokes, no confirmations. Just chaotic calls for direction, jammed signals, and panic. I can't see them. They're in the clouds. He's right behind. Why cut off? Another transmission gone, Galland's rage turned icy. Not impulsive, not reckless, cold, focused. He locked onto a lightning and fired short bursts. Struck metal. One of the twin tails shattered. A clean kill. But for every one he dropped, 3 of theirs burned apprentices against masters. By midday, the horizon looked like 1940, but in reverse. Smoke curled up from towns and forests. Bomb craters chewed roads into ruins. Debris fell like snow. Galland guided his battered 109 toward an emergency strip. Limping with a damaged wing, he landed hard, skidded, hopped out, heart still hammering. The field, or what was left of it, was a graveyard of twisted aluminum and scorched rubber. A canopy half open and blackened. A boot unmoving, sticking out from under a tarp. A medic ran past with an empty stretcher. No survivors. Galland ripped off his helmet and bent low over the dirt, resting his hands on his knees, trying to process the scale of what he had just witnessed. A staff officer approached quietly. "Sir. 9th Squadron. 70% not returning." Galland didn't speak. The silence between their words was unbearable. Göring stood before his staff, adorned once again in white medals clinking like mockery. He raised a glass. "Our brave boys fought back with tooth and claw. This is proof of their resolve. The Luftwaffe remains supreme in Europe." Applause followed. Not from those who fought, but those who ordered others to die. Galland arrived hours later, face sunburned, jacket still smelling of burned fuel. He stormed the hallway as aides tried to slow him. His eyes met Göring's at the door to the war room. No salute, just for words. "We are finished here." Later that evening, Galland sat alone in the officers' mess. The lights dimmed to spare power. He found Lieutenant Franz's personal effects on a supply crate, a comb, a wristwatch, a folded note meant for his mother. Labeled lovingly in cursive, Galland opened the envelope. The boy had started a sentence, but it trailed off mid-thought. "If I don't make it, tell her." That was all, no closure, no ending. Like so many lives that vanished into the August sky in his wartime journal. Galland wrote one line that night before sleeping. "We had lost more than altitude. We'd lost the room to lie to ourselves." The Reich had gambled that bravery would bridge the chasm left by bad planning. It didn't. The enemy had crossed oceans, crossed technological barriers, crossed lines of fear and doubt, and now they were here. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was gasping for breath, too proud to scream, too broken to stand. And tomorrow the bombers would come again. Galland knew that, so he sharpened his pencil and kept writing. Rain began to fall 2 days later, quiet, cold, and without meaning, the shattered remnants of Galland's squadrons sat in the corner of a hangar, wings torn, engines stripped dry, like birds that would never fly again. Mechanics worked in silence, their hands moving automatically, their minds blank with grief and exhaustion outside. The stretch of grass beside the runway had turned into a muddy cemetery. Wooden rifle stocks had been driven into the ground, each one crowned with a rusting helmet. No names, no inscriptions, just rows, row after row of silence. Galland walked between them with a slow, stiff gait. He counted them, though he already knew the number. 70-9. Each one. A boy he had spoken to, slapped on the back. Wished good luck. "Lead to," he paused at one rifle. A piece of paper was tied to the trigger guard with string. Carefully printed in pencil, it read, "Fr Mutter. Ich hab's versekt," for mother. I tried. He didn't know which boy had written it. He couldn't know any more. Reports came in that afternoon. Official statements from Berlin. Neat. Orderly pages typed on crisp paper, free of the stench of oil or the taste of blood. The leaders had declared the Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission a propaganda win. The bomber losses had been severe for the Allies, they claimed, proving the Luftwaffe's overwhelming resilience. Galland dropped the report onto his desk. Watching it land beside a crumpled flight map stained with someone else's blood, he had no words for what was happening anymore. His aide entered and stood stiff. "General Field Marshal Göring is requesting your presence at headquarters. There's a briefing." Galland didn't look up. "You mean there's another performance?" he said. He stood anyway. He always did. By the time Galland reached Berlin, the rain had followed him. He stepped inside the marble hall of the Luftwaffe High Command, its golden eagle emblem still polished to a glimmer. The building was untouched by the war. Fresh flowers adorned the corners. Cigarette smoke floated like ghosts among the fattened generals inside. Göring entered last, cloaked in white, medals clinking like coins in an emperor's pocket. He raised a hand. "Gentlemen," he began with a grin, "I'm proud to report that our fighter arm remains the envy of Europe." Laughter echoed. Smiles nodded back. Someone even clapped. Galland remained still. When Göring pushed open a giant map across the table, covered in colored lines and crew estimates, Galland finally spoke. Permission to address the room. The generals stopped. Göring waved his hand dismissively. Of course. Say something inspiring." Galland stared at the map, then at the men. Thin-faced, gold-trimmed, dry boots. "I've flown through fire. I've watched our boys burn alive in their cockpits. I've held the last letters they wrote while they still believed in this command. And I've watched you all," he looked directly at Göring, "continue to count these boys as numbers on a page." The smile slipped from Göring's face. "You have overestimated air superiority. You have rejected reality. And now we send children to fight technologies you refuse to understand." A slow pause. "No more parades," Galland said. "No more reports touching up the truth. We are losing. And if we carry on like this," his voice dropped into something quieter, heavier, "we will lose with nothing left but our egos intact." Göring's nostrils flared. "These ... accusations are unhelpful," he said coldly, "and bordering on treason." Galland looked around the room. No voice offered support. Not a single man stood with him as he walked out of the meeting. The sound of polished shoes behind him trickled back into applause. He never turned around. That night, he returned to his quarters and opened the tiny black notebook, the one he kept hidden beneath his socks. He wrote one sentence. "Treason is the word cowards use when they're afraid of truth." The radio announced later that evening that the Reich would reduce defensive aerial efforts. A new strategy was coming. Galland knew what that meant. New lies. Old ideas, with new names. The door to his office creaked open. An aide walked in, pale, trembling. "They're calling up the War College cadets. Barely 18. They're being fast-tracked to fighter training." Galland's jaw clenched. "They barely know how to fly." The aide nodded. Double quotes, "They know how to die, sir. And that's all anyone's asking of them now." A moment of silence passed between them. Then Galland nodded slowly. "Prepare the flight logs," he said quietly. "I'll fly the next sortie with them." "Sir, they can't go up there alone. Not on their first mission. Not like this." And still, no change in Berlin. The buildings stayed lit. The cigars stayed lit. But in the fields, in the factories, at the edge of every battered airstrip, the wind whispered something different now. Not victory, but vanishing. The winter of 1944 came with more silence than snow. American bombers were no longer fighting to reach Germany. They were flying through it. Escort fighters, once believed impossible, now filled the skies. The P-38s had been the beginning, but the P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks, that was the end. They could take a bomber from London to Berlin and back without losing a drop of firepower. And they did. Every day, the Luftwaffe never recovered. Galland watched from the ground now, not grounded by enemy fire, grounded by politics, by envy, by the very empire he once defended. His official title wasn't stripped, but his responsibilities were. Every idea, every suggestion, now met with smirks or silence, and still. He showed up every morning, cleaned his boots, and read the casualty reports like tombstones on a breakfast menu. The names never stopped. They just grew younger. He'd flip through the pages. Sometimes he saw a name he'd trained, a boy he'd taught to climb above the bomber stream and dive like thunder, and now gone, disappeared into the sky like vapor in his diary. He wrote one single word for them, NACH because that's what he had. Become an echo of a warning that no one had wanted to hear. Somewhere over France, a young American pilot tapped the picture of his fiancée taped to the instrument panel of his Mustang. He wasn't afraid, not the way his older brothers had been, not anymore. German fighters were ghosts, rare sightings, their numbers shrinking by the hour. "We own the air," one pilot whispered. His co-pilot just nodded. But even among the Americans, Whispers of Galland still floated. He was the only one we respected. One veteran would say years later, him and maybe Hartmann, but Galland was the one who saw it all coming and got punished for telling the truth. Knew the war wasn't going to end. With a grand speech or a single factory explosion, it would end in silence because there would be no one left to fight it. By spring 1945, Allied air superiority was so absolute that German flak guns often fired blind. Bombers reached Berlin midday uninterrupted, unchallenged, not because they were untouchable, but because there were no fighters left to rise. Galland walked across an airfield one morning, what used to be the heart of a fighter wing. Now, weeds broke through the concrete. A single wrecked 109 lay rusting in the corner, its propeller slowly turning in the wind. He lit a cigarette, stared at the sky, and murmured to a mechanic nearby. They fly overhead now like they own the place. The mechanic just stared quietly at the ground. They do, sir, years later, after the war had ended. Galland was asked in an interview what he would have changed. Had he the chance, he paused for a long time, then answered, "Listened to the enemy more," he said, because what they feared was what we should have built. What the Americans feared was exactly what could have changed the war. Jet propulsion, rocket interceptors, strategic honesty. But while Galland begged for progress, Berlin glued medals on failure. He began giving talks, not as a loyalist, but as a survivor, burdened with memory. He told rooms full of veterans the truth. They already knew, but couldn't say out loud. Our arrogance killed more Germans than Allied bullets ever did. And yet, the legacy wasn't entirely lost. Allied generals studied his tactics. His flight behavior became required reading in U.S. training programs. Galland's combat notes recovered in the ruins of Berlin were preserved in Allied archives, studied by pilots for generations after. Not because he was their enemy, but because he had honored the fight. More than many who gave the orders, he had offered warnings, shown the future, and was exiled for it. In 1981, decades after the last bomber returned home, a retired American pilot visited Galland in Germany. They sat in a quiet garden, pouring coffee, laughing like men freed from nightmares. Before leaving, the pilot handed Galland a folded clipping. It was yellowed now with time, a frontline report from 1943. The headline read, "Luftwaffe ace warns of deep escort, Göring dismisses claim." Galland held it for a long time, then smiled sadly. Even the truth needs fuel. And back then, I was flying on empty. The war ended. The reckoning did not. Cemeteries filled. Flags changed hands. Maps were redrawn. Bombers were scrapped. But the silence, the guilt, stayed. And some names, like Galland's, curled into the folds of memory. Not always remembered for what they did, but for what they tried to do. He had not saved the Luftwaffe. No one could. Not after the ignorance, the delays, the parade of blind decisions. But he had dared to confront the lie, in a war of smoke and shadows. Galland had stood clear-eyed and shouted, what none of his superiors dared admit, that truth can come from within the belly of the beast and still be ignored after the war. Adolf Galland did not hide. He did not vanish like so many of his peers. Swallowed by shame or surrender, he became a historian of his own tragedy, giving lectures, meetings, interviews, not to glorify German planes or Nazi failures, but to make sure the next generation knew what denial looked like up close and what it cost. He once said, reflection in his voice, "We didn't lack courage. We lacked clarity. We were flying blind, and no one in command wanted to open their eyes." Even late in life, Galland would walk the old concrete runways alone sometimes, a cane in one hand, a cigarette in the other. Watching nothing pass overhead, those skies once alive with fire now held only birds and the memories of those who never came home. In the end, his story wasn't just about airplanes. It was about a man who spoke when silence had become more acceptable, a voice raised in a room that ordered him to nod along, and he refused. Because sometimes, history doesn't remember those who made the loudest noise. It remembers the ones who warned us before it was too late. So when you read the reports, or hear the speeches, or watch neat maps on television, remember, the man who once shouted across a table covered in medals and lies, "We are finished here," he wasn't wrong. And the world paid in blood for not listening because history was warned. If you want more stories like this of truth, tragedy, and the forgotten voices who knew what was coming. Subscribe, like, share. But to remember those who bore its weight and tried to stop the avalanche before it fell.